Hello, everyone. I'm Vanessa Grossel, Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments. I'm the staff liaison to the Capacity, Preparedness, and Resiliency Subcommittee of CSG's Healthy States National Task Force. The subcommittee is focused on building resilient communities that are able to prepare for, respond to, and recover from community-level disasters and public health crises. I'm joined today by David Mazzuca, an instructor at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Earth Institute, to talk about state government's role in building community resilience. From 2015 to 2019, he served as Assistant Director for Housing Recovery with New Jersey's Sandy Recovery Division in Trenton, New Jersey. And in that role, he was responsible for administering the delivery of New Jersey's post-Sandy housing restoration grant programs, $1.4 billion in federal funds, serving approximately 8,000 applicants. Preceding his tenure with the state of New Jersey, he served as an Economic Development Fellow with the City of New York. His previous professional experience includes IHS Jane's Terrorism and Insurgency Center in London, the United Kingdom, and BAE Systems U.S. Government Services practice in Arlington, Virginia. David received a BA in Urban Studies and an MS in Real Estate Development from Columbia University and an MA in War Studies from King's College London. He was a 2018 Marshall Memorial Fellow. Welcome, David.
Vanessa, thank you for having me.
Tell us about your role in the Hurricane Sandy recovery and how that experience informed your thinking around state efforts at building capacity, preparedness, and resiliency.
Certainly. As you mentioned in your intro, I served as Assistant Director for Housing Recovery for 4 years, from 2015 to 2019. Prior to that, from 2013 to 2015, I served as Program Specialist for New Jersey's Small Rental Affordable Housing Recovery Program. So for nearly 6 years, I found myself in a position developing policy and implementing programs that had a real-world impact on the lives of my fellow New Jerseyans. In short, my job and that of my colleagues was to get our applicants back home. We created scalable, community-focused solutions that mitigated financial risks on one hand and political vulnerabilities on the other. Day-to-day operations varied. One day I may be having back-to-back budget meetings with internal stakeholders, and the next day I may be out in the field, working with state electeds or community activists. Whether managing contracted vendors or mapping out systems improvements, we dealt with challenges in real time under a pressurized environment. Decisions often could not be delayed weeks, but rather addressed in days. And to be very honest, pragmatism was our reigning ethos. Now, to the second part of your question, my experience has led me to challenge the existing, de facto, dare I say, way we conduct disaster recovery here in the United States. Too often, states find themselves in the months following a disaster ill-prepared to manage the receipt of federal funds that come in the form of Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, CDBG-DR dollars. Without building institutional preparedness into your organization, in this case, state government, you are not only more likely to make mistakes, but you will lose time in delivering recovery dollars that your constituents may urgently need.
David, maybe you could start at the beginning of the disaster recovery process so that our members who have not received Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery dollars or disbursements can better understand the process.
Definitely. To keep it at a very high level, following a major disaster, most governors seek a presidential disaster declaration. In the immediate period following disaster and that declaration, FEMA is the federal agency that operationally and financially responds to and supports states' governments. Separately, the affected state's congressional delegation usually begins the process to introduce for passage an emergency supplemental. That emergency supplemental is to appropriate community development block grant disaster recovery funding, which would then be dispersed through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD. Statutory authority is through the emergency supplemental appropriation, meaning states rely upon the published Federal Register notice, a document that's put out by HUD for guidance on eligible activities and program requirements. Now, assuming successful passage of that emergency supplemental, which may take a few months or longer, states then need to wait for the said Federal Register notice, which too may take time. Then states need to respond to the awarding of such funds with an action plan. An action plan is a grantee's, that being a state's, blueprint on how they will seek to spend those funds, all subject to HUD approval. The development of an action plan by a state and subsequent approval by HUD can also take months. In the case of New Jersey, the supplemental was passed in January, Federal Register notice posted in February, and our action plan was approved in April. With action plan approval, states can begin to fully flesh out their proposed programs with the development of policies and procedures, and then launch the said programs. In New Jersey's case, we launched our programs in June 2013. To be clear, though, people are in need during that period of time between disaster and appropriation of funds and program launch. FEMA may provide limited financial assistance to citizens, but to those in the community who may have lost their entire home and lack financial means to begin the reconstruction process, community development block grant DR dollars and the programs that will disperse those dollars are needed as soon as possible. To summarize, the process can be divided up into three key time intervals. First, disaster to congressional passage of an emergency supplemental appropriation. Second, passage of the emergency supplemental to development and approval of the action plan, inclusive of waiting on the publishing of the Federal Register notice. And then third, approval of the action plan to actual program launch.
Thank you for that overview. I think that it is very helpful for our members, and I assume naturally that the reduction of time between each time interval is key.
Exactly. That said, states are only in control for some of those intervals.
So with that in mind, if you could, walk through how you see that states can reduce the time lag for those intervals that it has control over.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So states cannot control how long it takes Congress, for instance, to pass an emergency supplemental. So resources need to be devoted to what is in their control. We have two periods of time in state control: the length of time to develop an action plan and length of time to launch programs following action plan approval. The obvious answer is to shorten the time it takes to develop the action plan and the program policies and procedures, respectively. Let's call that the programmatic approach, which I will explore more in a moment. But it is also important to understand the role that personnel plays in institutions' capacity to manage disaster recovery programs, which I will call the institutional approach. Action plans and policies and procedures require knowledgeable staff who have the ability to build out such documents and operationalize the programs. Starting with the institutional approach, it is important for states to both have some semblance of capabilities to manage funds and the ability to build out a disaster recovery organization. Nationally, you are beginning to see some states standing up permanent offices of resiliency that could house disaster recovery personnel with disaster recovery experience. In New Jersey, conversations are ongoing to do just that. I should note, though, that one state's permanent resiliency office may not have the same capabilities as another state's. For example, Florida has their Office of Resiliency and Coastal Protection. North Carolina has the Office of Recovery and Resiliency. Florida focuses on coastal protection and wetlands, whereas North Carolina is dedicated to managing federal funds to mitigate and recover from recent and future disasters. The important message is that states are beginning to build out the organizational infrastructure to better manage disaster recovery through institutional preparedness. States need to be prepared to manage the recovery from a disaster. One option would be to establish a resiliency or recovery office, understanding how your organization will be structured and where it will be housed, albeit one that may be lightly staffed, but is already identified as the lead coordinating agency. Another option would be to establish a reserve force of designated personnel in other departments across state government to be seconded to a disaster recovery or resiliency office in the event of a disaster. Personally, I think this reform is key. States often seek out their procurement team after CDBG-DR appropriations to hire government contractors with subject matter expertise to assist in, if not entirely, build out the action plan and program policies and procedures. In my opinion, solely relying on outside government contractors is not only a mistake, but further delays program development and implementation when waiting for bids. By organically building out their own institutional preparedness, states ensure that they will have the capacity to develop and operationalize any recovery programs that they see fit to launch. Through such an exercise, states will understand what existing knowledge they have in-house, what they need to obtain from other states that have endured other disasters, and what, if any, outside contracted support is needed. In some instances, outside subject matter experts may be necessary. But remember, these contractors are your partners. You want to work with them and keep that relationship as healthy as possible. Hiring out government contractors should be done from a position of situational awareness by a state, rather than out of weakness because the state is overwhelmed and does not know what to do first. Now, onto the programmatic approach. Every state is different, and every disaster is different. Thus, there is not a single one-size-fits-all approach that states could follow, or that the federal government could, or even should, suggest to the states. That being said, more can be done to develop skeleton policies and templates and recovery-focused white papers, inclusive of national or local lessons learned ahead of time by states. At the very least, it would behoove states to understand what type of programs, in broad brushstrokes, they would like to develop and implement in the event of a disaster. Is your housing recovery program limited to low to moderate income populations only? Or is it open to all those affected by the disaster? Will you be relaxing permit requirements immediately following the disaster? Who or what entities will be responsible for construction? These are the types of questions that are best, at a minimum, brainstormed before disaster strikes.
Do you have any recommendations for states on how to begin to think through what potential housing recovery programs would look like?
Yes, I do. Much can be gained from speaking with other states that have experienced a disaster and received CDBG-DR funds. Over the last 2 years, HUD has taken the initiative to host annual conferences for Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery grantees. But these events are only for those who have received funding, so they do not benefit states that most acutely could benefit, states that need the knowledge to best manage funding from day one. So on that front, states need to be self-starters, for lack of a better word. I think of South Carolina as an example. Following the series of hurricanes nearly 5 years ago, Governor Haley proactively had state officials reach out to CDBG-DR recipients to learn how best to design and execute their own programs. Honestly, this was not common practice. States often seek out government contractors with subject matter expertise rather than have direct conversations with counterparts immediately after a disaster or disbursement of funds. This is a mistake. You should learn from your peers. I would encourage states who have not experienced a disaster and federal dollar disbursement in recent years to proactively reach out to states that have, specifically states with like disasters. For example, a hurricane to hurricane state or wildfire to wildfire state. Let the best resource be one that does not require procurement. Let it be a colleague in another state.
Thank you. And can you speak to any recommendations that you have for the design of housing recovery programs?
Sure. States need to design programs that are responsive to the individual nature of the disaster and their communities. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach, so I'm hesitant to recommend a single path. In New Jersey, we opened up our housing recovery programs to those with household incomes of less than $250,000 a year. In South Carolina, they limited the program to their low to moderate income population. Over 90% of applicants in New Jersey's programs selected their own contractor and had contracts with said contractors that the state was not a party to, whereas South Carolina contracted directly with contractors to rehabilitate or reconstruct affected homes. Applicant-driven programs like New Jersey require less human capital to manage, but do take longer, as it is driven by the applicant schedule. South Carolina-like programs require more direct construction management, but should have a shorter time horizon, as it is entirely in state control. I do want to note that thus far, in housing recovery, states have normally chosen to tie disbursement of recovery dollars to the restoration of housing on the affected property. This unfortunately ties a homeowner to a vulnerable piece of land. Yes, this restores the tax base of an affected community and hypothetically prevents said community from becoming physically abandoned and a financial burden on its respective state. But is this the right decision for the individual constituent? I would encourage states to consider if providing financial assistance not tied to the property, but rather the individual, and thus allowing them to move elsewhere within the county or state is right for their community. In some states, this may politically be a challenge, but I do want to provide this idea as food for thought to your members, that by allowing the individual homeowner to make the rebuild or not rebuild decision for themselves and move if they want, rather than possibly keeping them in harm's way.
And in the event that Congress does not pass an emergency supplemental following a disaster, what kind of ideas do you have for states hoping to take control of a greater share of their own recovery planning?
Very interesting question. It is generally assumed that if a disaster rises to that of a presidential disaster declaration, then Congress will appropriate CDBG-DR funding. But it is just that, assumed. We may be in a position 5 years from now that Congress chooses to only provide CDBG-DR dollars for events meeting certain monetary thresholds, for example. What then for smaller, less costly disasters that do still severely impact communities? I would encourage states to think about how they would fund disaster recovery programs without federal dollars, whether that is allocating funds for a disaster recovery bank in the state budget, or thinking through what a bond issuance would look like. There is no easy answer to that question, and unclear when states will need to think about that. But it would serve all parties to think through now how they would find such funds in order to recover from smaller scale disasters.
Much of our conversation has focused on program design and organizational reforms. When it comes to the construction component of housing recovery, do you have any comments for our members?
Sure. Well, each state will design their programs differently. As I mentioned before, in the case of New Jersey, a significant majority of our applicants contracted with their own building contractor, whereas in South Carolina, all applicants used a state-selected building contractor. There are a few key takeaways to be aware of. Firstly, if you choose a South Carolina model that to contract with builders directly, ensure that whatever RFQ you develop is explicit with the expectations and standards you will hold to your builders. Second, states should be prepared for a shortage of prime contractors and subcontractors immediately following a disaster. As a result of that, states will see out-of-state building contractors appear in their respective states. While these builders may bring unique expertise, for example, house lifting, that your in-state contractors lack, and may fill any skill gap or a local shortage of labor. They will also bring a lack of knowledge about local building codes and permitting, who the reputable subs are in the community, among other information that only an in-state contractor would know. As a state government, you will need to make a decision whether to require or incentivize the hiring of in-state contractors. The other thing to keep in mind is that while there is a federal debarment list, if another state has debarred a contractor, it is highly unlikely that you will have access to that state's list. This makes you vulnerable to fraudulent, even criminally convicted contractors. Without a national 50-state debarment database, meaning one in which you can find a contractor was debarred in another state, the only way to avoid this potential problem is contract with in-state contractors.
We have discussed the role of states and the relationship states have with contracted vendors, but what about the relationship between states and disaster survivors, the potential applicants in any recovery program?
Great question. Naturally, any CDBG-DR funded state developed program is designed to service an affected population in some form. The key to the applicant-government relationship is for both parties to understand each other. What do I mean? First, states should remember an adage I use with my team in New Jersey. I used to say our job is to balance that being the steward of the U.S. taxpayer and the servant of the people of New Jersey. Too often, politics may lean on the scale to that of being the servant of the people of your state. But in each policy decision, it behooves decision makers to consider the U.S. taxpayer. Remember that a tough, unpopular political call may be the right program call, and thus, in the long term, may ultimately become the right political call. Back to your question, it is important for potential applicants in any program to be as knowledgeable as possible, understanding what a program is and what a program isn't, as well as for potential applicants to be educated consumers. The state has a role in working with potential applicants to achieve both, bridging the gap between what is perceived and what is reality. From the beginning, communicate with applicants clearly and directly. Host town halls to explain to potential applicants program criteria, that the program may not be the right one for everyone, that the program may evolve, what to be mindful of when hiring construction contractors, thus being educated consumers. States should set as a program application requirement attendance of at least one in-person town hall so that you can ensure that potential applicants hear from an official source the program parameters.
Do you have any recommendations on how states should build after a disaster, such as limiting construction along a coastline or along a river, or challenges to implementing these policies?
The short answer is yes. Responding to a disaster through more resilient construction and thoughtful mitigation is key. Nearly 90% of the homes in our recovery programs in New Jersey were either elevated rehabs or elevated new construction. While in the event of flooding or storm surge, elevated homes protect private structures. It is important to think holistically about public infrastructure, sewers, utilities, etc. We will not be elevating sewer lines, for instance. I say this for us to think about reconstruction a bit differently, and not just about the private housing recovery, but rather as community recovery. Too often, housing and infrastructure are seen as two distinct recovery conversations. Thus, buyouts, or managed retreat, may have a place in some communities. The burden placed on local governments or state governments needs to be calculated into the equation when it comes to recovery efforts, and in particular, when considering buyouts.
So you mentioned buyouts. Are strengthened building codes and buyouts compromises that you feel states should consider?
Yes. That said, some states do already have robust building codes for hazards that may afflict their community. I am of the school of thought that if you already are envisioning strengthening your post-disaster building codes before the disaster strikes, it may very well be a prudent code update to make actually before the disaster strikes. Importantly, continuing along the buyout train of thought, states should understand what they want their post-disaster environment to look like. Disasters do make homeowners who may otherwise be hesitant for buyouts more interested in taking a buyout offer. The more pre-planning you can do, for instance, in understanding what communities you may want to offer buyouts to first, the better.
How effective is insurance, and is it something you would recommend that states recommend to individuals and business owners as part of their preparedness plan?
Yes, it is effective and something that I would recommend. Often, though, insurance will not make applicants whole. Many of our applicants in New Jersey had some kind of insurance and did receive a payout, but we're still in need of additional funds to complete the rehabilitation or reconstruction of their homes. I should note that in the event of an individual receiving Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program funds, they are then required to purchase flood insurance as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. But actually having insurance is just one component of a preparedness plan. Individuals and business owners should understand specifically what their coverage is. Too often, individuals and business owners make assumptions about coverage, only to be disappointed when it is too late post-disaster.
What role, if any, does the federal government have in assisting states in reforming the existing process?
Vanessa, historically, disaster housing recovery programs operate as if they are building a plane in mid-flight. While we have focused on reforms that states can make to better prepare to manage the influx of Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery dollars, more can be done by Congress. I would encourage the appropriate congressional committees to hold hearings to better understand the most prudent way to effectively and efficiently assist individuals in recovering from a disaster. We all should remember that disaster recovery funding is one of the largest expansions of the federal government since the year 2000. Billions of dollars have been allocated in response to disasters over the last 20 years. Appropriating recovery funds should not require an emergency supplemental, but rather be a thoughtful and deliberative process that precedes an actual disaster.
Thank you, David. I appreciate you for joining us today and commend you for your work. We are grateful to you for making time to share your expertise, which will help greatly to inform the work of our subcommittee and the task force. I'm Vanessa Grossel at CSG headquarters in Lexington, Kentucky, and I've been speaking with David Mazzuca of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Earth Institute.
Thank you, Vanessa, for having me.